Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this session that SENSS is organizing on generative AI. Today's session is about AI and producing and analyzing data from a quality perspective. Anna Canhoto, our SENSS Deputy Director, and Joss Winn will be sharing the session. Just before I hand over to our speakers, I'd like to thank them for their time. And I was telling one of our speakers earlier that we've been yesterday to another workshop organized by one of the SENSS partners. And I realized that whatever we're doing with this series of sessions is actually quite good, quite advanced. We're covering a huge range of subjects. It's all available on YouTube for anybody who would like to revisit all the sessions. We have covered almost everything in terms of everything we could in terms of generative AI, and it's a very good tool. And I'd like to particularly thank the presenters who come and give their time to help us understand better all the answers and questions around generative AI. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Anna and Joss for the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franciscus. Thank you for mentioning the series. So this is the seventh installment of our generative AI series. Our topics have covered all the stages of research, the research process or the research cycle. And you can catch up or watch for the first time the videos on our YouTube channel. Before we start, I want to give a heads up that our next session is taking place next week on Wednesday. And whereas today we focus mostly on text, the next one will explore other aspects, visual and other types of methods and data. Sorry if I'm looking to the side, it's because that's where your photos are. But today we're going to look at qualitative data, mostly from a textual perspective. I will kick off looking at how to collect and generate, how AI can be used. I'm not saying you should, but how it could be, so just you are aware of how it could be used to generate or collect data. And then Joss will take over and talk about it from the data analysis perspective. In our first session, we introduced this framework where whenever you're thinking about using AI, you need to consider very carefully their strengths and weaknesses. So the technology itself, but then also considering the social norms surrounding your research. And this includes the formal norms, such as, for instance, GDPR regulations, academic misconduct regulation, and the informal ones, such as how technology is perceived in your field. So this session, and certainly my part, focuses only on the technical aspects, what it could be a strength or a weakness, but please, before you proceed, consider also the context in which you're doing your research. For instance, environmental concerns, and so on. So let me look at the role of generative AI in the terms of generating data for your research. So the first thing we do, of course, and remember, talk about text data here or interview data. We need to develop our interview questions. And generative AI, LLMs specifically being trained on text data, they can be really helpful in terms of improving how we ask questions. So interviews are really a common method in qualitative research, certainly in social sciences, either as the primary method of collecting data or alongside other methods in a range of research designs. They allow for in-depth insight. You can also understand the context within which the phenomenon takes place. And above all, it's really valuable because it's flexible. You can rephrase if the question is not clear. You can ask people to expand, to provide examples. You can even adapt it depending on your philosophy of research design. You can adapt it as you go along. This should, on the one hand, it should be the easiest of data collection methods because it's about talking with others, and this is what you do every day. But on the other hand, as many qualitative researchers may have felt, if you don't design it properly, it actually doesn't generate the level of insight you want, or you may get distracted, you may sidetracked, and this may harm the credibility of the study. So when we do qualitative research, when we design interviews, we need to think carefully about the who, the how many, the what, and the how. And I want to focus now specifically on the what and how LLMs may help us decide what to ask and how to ask. And I'll give examples of a recent study that I'm engaged in at the moment, where we're looking at the use of AI in emergency call centers, so to help triage and collect information to accelerate the response. And here, for instance, when you think about what to ask, first of all, you need to make sure that your questions allow you to answer the research question. So one of the things you could do is you could upload to your chatbot of choice, which could be Notebook LM or Copilot or ChatGPT, and say, this is my research question, this is the interview questions I have so far, to what extent, are there any gaps here? What am I missing? What should I ask in order to understand this? Something else you might say is, of course, again, depending on your research design, if you have a research framework, you want to make sure that all the dimensions are covered. That you have, for instance, you don't have just one question, or that you covered every single one, or not too heavy on one dimension versus the other. You may also look at, for instance, one of the things we did was we did a literature review, we uploaded the review and make sure, are these questions reflecting the latest everything I should, because for instance, actually let me backtrack. So we had a framework that had been widely used in adoption of technology, but this framework had not yet been, so that we had examples of questions from previous studies, but these questions were not about AI. So then we wanted to capture the latest things about use of AI and make sure that the questions captured those things rather than just these old questions that had been asked in previous studies. And one of the things that was emerging was the role of attitude towards AI, to what extent you see it as a tool or as a companion, and that might impact on how you use the technology. So we wanted to make sure that the questions capture that. We also want to make sure that the questions were adapted to the context. For instance, we shouldn't be talking about customers, we should talk about citizens or callers or something like that. We also wanted to avoid mistakes. So the first round of questions, for instance, there were a lot of closed questions like, yes, do you do this? Whereas for insight, we really should be having open questions. So this allowed us to flag these kind of problems, or questions that were too complex, where you should split the question into two, things like that. Or we could use prompt the LLM to tell us how to improve the question along these. You could also use it in some context to translate, for instance, to a different language. I do work in English mostly, but I'm Portuguese. I do some work in Portugal. So I often develop the interview guide in English and then ask it to translate into Portuguese, just faster. But then be careful here, because only do this for a language that you know about, because as I mentioned in the previous presentation, it does have bias. It does translate doctor to male and nurse to female. It does translate pilot to male and secretary to female. So do be careful with this bias. There may also be a lack of representation of certain languages or certain fields, and these may impact on the quality of the questions that you get. But once you do this, so this is how I've used it in the past to develop questions, and it is also possible to use AI to conduct the interviews themselves. And use of technology is not new. And so whenever I talk about these, people say, surely you want to do interviews face-to-face. And I understand there is a lot of benefits in doing interviews face-to-face. But there are many circumstances where it is better or only possible to use technology to do the interviews. And we've been recently, or I think we're all used to do interviews via Zoom or Microsoft Teams. But there are also cases where you can do interviews versus WhatsApp. And there was, for instance, there is a very interesting study dealing with refugees, right? It's difficult to go to a refugee camp and do interviews, but most people will have a phone and they can be interviewed on their phones, either synchronously or asynchronously. There are also cases where you may do interviews by email. And for instance, one of the studies I came across, these were interviews about traumatic events and or how people were dealing with the chronic illness. And here you give people time to respond when they want and to process their emotions. So actually doing the interviews by email is better for the participant from a comfort perspective. So there are reasons sometimes when using technology can help. It can be more convenient for you or the participant. It could increase accessibility and inclusion, because it may be difficult for someone with a disability, mental or physical illness, to collect data face-to-face, but this includes the increased inclusion of participants as well as researchers. Participants can better control when to respond, when they're more comfortable, when they're feeling stronger, especially if you're dealing with people with chronic illness, for instance. It's ease of recording and transcription, and it could allow you to reach a broader sample than if you have to do the interviews all by yourself, face to face. Though, of course, there are problems in terms of data protection. You do lose visual cues, which could be sometimes important in terms of understanding if the person is being honest or uncomfortable and so on. It is a challenge to establish rapport, so you do need to spend time doing that. And of course, there are limited opportunities for probing. But if you're going to use data, if you're going to use technology to collect data, then maybe AI can help you. Could make sense for your research. So I'm not saying you should use it, but if you are using it, please consider whether these could help you. Here is an example of a study, interviews during COVID, where it was asking people how they were dealing with long COVID and how they were dealing with working from home and so on, right? And here, this is an example. This paper provides an example of how they used AI to conduct interviews with these agents. So that instead of having, say, an email, you have a chatbot where, or you have an interface where the AI asks a question and the person responds, then comes the next question, then respond. So in this case, this is rules-based. It's not generative AI. The questions are predefined and they follow the questions are predefined and they will follow an order, or they may react to certain words, but it's not entirely generative. It's rules-based. More recently, there is this team from the LSE that has developed a LLM to conduct interviews. And they in this paper, they explain how they developed it and how you can adapt it to your research. So you give it some prompts about the kind of questions and the kind of persona to adapt, and then you can interact with the participants. These two authors, they tested it in different scenarios, and then they compared the performance of using LLMs for interviews versus using open-ended questions. So again, this is not face-to-face interviews. This is like using email interviews or things like that, technology-mediated interviews. And they did find that actually people enjoyed talking with the AI, and they wouldn't mind in the future to be interviewed by an AI. And they actually preferred it to using it. They'd rather be interviewed by the AI than using open-ended questions. And I've participated in studies as a participant where I was interviewed by an AI. And I have to say that personally, I do enjoy it. I much prefer it to typing answers, because I can ask guys like, what do you mean? Or I don't know, maybe this, maybe that. Can you give me an example? I do enjoy the process of being interviewed by an LLM personally. But it seems that I'm not alone, that other respondents enjoyed being interviewed by an AI better than open-ended questions. And from the point of view of the responses, so when we had people analyzing the responses, they do find that AI-led interviews, this is still from the people at the end, they felt that they felt that they would be able to express themselves more clearly, and then when using an AI than open text, and they tended to generate longer answers, which is a problem for qualitative researchers. When we collect data using technology, open-ended questionnaires, we tend to have really short answers, and using the LLM, you tended to have longer answers and more insightful. And here, this is what I meant, sorry, that from the point of view of analysts, they felt that AI-led interviews generated deeper understanding of what the participants felt than closer, so deeper insights. And then the last example is actually interviewing the AI. And I know that some people hate this idea. I'm not saying you should do it, but if you are in a field where simulations are used, where you work with synthetic data, then maybe AI may seem for you. This is used actually quite a bit in marketing research, for instance. It may be used in operations, I'm guessing, where you are simulating how people, for instance, how people might react if you cut the price. What would they like? Or you have a new campaign, or you have to do some market research. Or it could be when you're dealing with difficult to reach populations. For instance, I had a project where we were considering this to engage with prisoners, because it's actually really difficult to get permission to talk with prisoners. So if you have enough data about the personas, not the phenomenon, but the personas, for instance, people from a certain ethnic background, or people with dyslexia, or so on, then you can create personas, and then you can ask them questions and change incentives, and then get some answers that may or may not be relevant. So these researchers, they tried a number of simulations with AI, they found that actually when they were interviewing the AI, the answers were not as easy to read as when they were interviewing people. So the answers were a bit more, which I found surprising. Maybe they were a bit more convoluted, maybe because it was more difficult to probing, I don't know. But there was whenever they used, so if they had humans interviewing the AI as opposed to AI interviewing the AI, then they could get more richer information, more coherent. When compared to human generated data, it's generated similar level of insight, but some insights were unique to LLM and others, so they were not mentioned by the humans, by the LLM, and vice versa. So it's still very exploratory. I wouldn't recommend you to use this for your research, but it could make sense to use it, for instance, at the first stage of a pilot of your interview, something like that. And with this, I will hand over to Joss. So this is my quick overview of how it might be used. I think we leave questions for the end, right? I think it might be better.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. I'll just share my screen. And you should see some slides, I hope, just some slides and not everything else.
We can see notes. We can see your slides and the notes on the next slide.
Notes as well, can you? Oh, well, there are no notes, but I'd rather you just saw the slides. No.
Maybe you need to, in display settings, you want to swap the displays at the top, maybe?
Swap present. That is that better?
But
okay. Well, hello everyone, and thanks for having me this week. Well, Anna just ended with the statement that you know, at this point it's all quite exploratory, and I think I will pick up on that point and say that what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is exploratory. I've not started or even completed a research project where I've applied any of these analytical techniques. I'm still teaching myself, trying to understand the implications, reading the increasing amount of literature on using AI for qualitative research. Well, I'll share my thoughts and also give a brief demonstration, and then we can talk at the end about the implications, really. So, sorry, there's quite a bit of text here, but really, it's I suppose it's the first point is probably for me the most important point. What I came to understand, and now it's, of course, it seems incredibly obvious to me, but AI has no subjectivity. So it appears to have subjectivity, but it does not. And I'm sure that you're aware now, if you've used AI in the chatbots, it feels like there is a person there, but there is not. So AI has no understanding. It has no experience and no reflexivity. So by our usual understanding of qualitative research, it's outside of the interpretive research paradigm. Okay, so I suppose the first point is that the use of AI to analyze your data is not interpretive research as we normally understand it. It's a quantitative method of analysis that produces qualitative outputs that do in fact compare well with human manual coding, and we can presume we'll get better. And you'll see from some of the references later, if you read them, that researchers are now finding that there is a high degree of similarity between AI and human analysis, maybe not quite with the same amount of depth, but in terms of coverage. So the problem is that it runs the risk of treating a quantitative artifact the coding, the thematic analysis, for example, as if it were a genuine interpretive insight. But we must remember it's text processing and not qualitative interpretation as we normally understand it. And really, that's the main point I want to get across today. And once you understand that, you can never forget it. And so it has to, you have to somehow acknowledge it, be cautious of it. And of course, as doctoral students, you have to be able to defend your choice of using it if that's what you do end up doing. Also, by having subjectivity does not mean that it's objective. AI has biases, hallucinations, and the design of technology is not neutral. And also, thank you, Anna, for sending me that paper, the Flanadian Sparrow paper, which again is referenced later. AI, and a lot of the research literature on using AI for qualitative analysis does talk about how it's best suited to be a kind of a research assistant. And we see that a lot. You know, no one wants to say out loud that AI is doing something that, you know, that could replace a human. The general response is AI is best used alongside humans. And this paper goes a bit further and says that it's not a research assistant, it's not a collaborator, because a collaborator can take responsibility for their work, whereas AI does not. So ultimately, you're responsible for this machine that actually you probably don't understand, in terms of it being a black box in the way that it works. What I found in preparing for today is, because I was looking at the different tools available, I was pleased to see that NVivo and Atlas, Atlas in particular, is integrating AI into the standard tools for qualitative analysis. Most of us are using AI through chatbots, and that gives us a very narrow view of how the kind of underlying technology might be used. We are limited by the user interfaces of ChatGPT, for example, and the various limitations that they put on throttling the use of the technology. You should be aware that if you think you can just upload all of your interview transcripts and then just kind of prompt it to analyze it for you, it doesn't work very well at all. You are best working on the smallest components of data, the smallest data sets you can, because you will get a richer response. The more data that you give it, the more superficial the response will be. So ultimately, chatbots are not designed for qualitative data analysis, but generative AI as an underlying technology is a useful tool and is being incorporated into specialist design tools. And these YouTube links, this an Atlas link, will give you demonstrations of how you can use it. And you know, it's promising. My sense is that we will increasingly be using generative AI for forms of qualitative analysis. It works. It seems to be getting better. You know, with all the kind of caveats that you will hear today and read about. The main issue for me, to go back to the first point I made, is that the use of AI is incompatible with some of the underlying philosophies of our current research methodologies. So yes, we might use AI for content analysis, possibly grounded theory. Personally, I cannot see how you could use it for phenomenology. And I don't see how you can use it for reflexive thematic analysis either, because both of those latter techniques of analysis are very much about human interpretation, and they're human-centered. There is a lot of emerging research on the topic, and there's a link there to Google Scholar that you'll see. And also, and I will just quickly share this with you, I've shared a notebook of some recent literature I found useful, and this link will take you to a Google Notebook LM, which is a tool I'll look at again in a second. You can query the data, you can get some overviews of the latest research on qualitative analysis, AI-driven qualitative analysis. You can also listen to a 15-minute podcast summary of all of this literature as well, and you know, it's a useful summary. So that's something for you to maybe look at next after today's session. How I first started playing around with all of this, was using Notebook LM, but now you can do a certain amount with creating your own GPT using ChatGPT, but I'll basically refer to Notebook LM for this. What I have done and keep kind of experimenting with Notebook LM is to think of it as a kind of exploratory workspace, separate from the organization, the formal organization of my data. But I use it as a place where I've put data, I've put related documentation, literature, you could put audio, you could put ebooks that you might have, like, you know, Braun and Clark and Saldana. Basically, you can just feed this AI with all the sources of information and data that you are accumulating and producing through your research. And then you can ask it questions. You can have a conversation with it in a way. You can start asking it to perform particular kind of inductive techniques against data that you may have added. And of course, those techniques will be informed by the methodological literature, if you've included that. You can also upload theoretical literature, so you can effectively tell it your conceptual framework, and you can say, okay, here's some data, analyze my data using this theoretical literature, and of course ask it to focus on particular concepts and see what it can find across your data. But you've got to remember that you're working with a black box, and you can never be sure of what the AI is overlooking, prioritizing and filtering out. And this is the big problem, or the big red flag. You know, you cannot use something like Notebook LM as your primary tool for data analysis, even though it will let you perform data analysis techniques on it. You will not be able to do so in a way that is rigorous, that is transparent, that is ultimately kind of ethical in the way that you would have to demonstrate in a PhD, in a Viva, and in a published thesis. So it might be useful as a personal exploratory space alongside the work you're doing on your PhD, but you could not take a tool like Notebook LM and say, this is you know, how I analyze my data. But I would recommend it. It's quite revealing working with Notebook LM in this way. It's quite, you know, I think it could be productive, but with all the caveats I've mentioned. So I'll give a brief demonstration. Well, yes, we have this Notebook LM here. I know Notebook LM has been introduced in previous sessions, so perhaps you're familiar with it, but effectively it's a Google tool. I'm using the Pro version, but the free version looks exactly the same, and except for the amount of data you can upload, there's no difference. And you can upload quite a lot of sources. It calls everything a source. So it could be a transcript, it could be a piece of literature, a audio interview, which it will transcribe, and so on. And then you can select sources to query specifically, or you can select them all. And if you like a response that it provides, you can then save that as a note. So you've got a record of its response. You can also create an audio podcast of the sources that you've given it. That might be a kind of useful way just to kind of think about the project as a whole, of course, it being selective. In fact, I'll just show you this.
Shift the potential interaction, doesn't it, from simply managing and finding patterns in the data towards something that feels a lot more like interacting with a research assistant, one potentially capable of engaging with the substance of the data itself.
Right. That conversational capability feels like the game changer.
Okay, so yeah, that's its podcast functionality. So you can ask it whatever questions you like, but if I just click on one of the suggested questions for speed, you can see the kind of response you get. This is particularly useful, I think, with literature, less so with data, because you really need to know your data very well, have a good grasp of it. Whereas if you've got literature and you're just looking for kind of key points from it, you could upload 50 articles, I think, with a free account and start querying it, and that would be a useful way. It doesn't replace reading it, but it's an alternative, or it's a complementary way of getting to grips with the literature. Okay, so we'll come back to that response because it might take a few more seconds. What I want to do is show you ChatGPT. Again, I'm using a paid account, but it will do pretty much the same with a free account. The University of Lincoln currently has a pilot with ChatGPT, so we've all been given, or some of us have been given, kind of so-called enterprise accounts. So what I am going to do next, I am borrowing from one of the articles that I've referenced, just to show you what ChatGPT can do. Let me just find, okay, so what I want to do, I will put the reference in the chat in Zoom later, because I want to make sure that the researchers are credited for this. But this is just a regular ChatGPT window, and I have taken and modified slightly for my own purposes something in the article I've just referred to, and I'm just going to copy and paste the text that I've pre-prepared. This is not data, this is instructions. So everything here is a prompt, okay? And this is where you realize that everything, particularly in this kind of tool, like I say, this is a chat bot. There are different, generative AI as an underlying technology can have lots of different interfaces, but with these chatbots, you've got to prompt, and this is an example of a prompt to code some data, okay, quite lengthy. And I've asked it to anonymize the data at the end. I should also say, let me just actually, before I forget, two things. You can personalize ChatGPT, so you can tell it what traits it should have. I ask it to avoid bullet points, British English, provide citations and references, responses for use in academic environment, and do not always find ways to agree with me, be critical. Okay, so be aware, if you're not already, that you can customize ChatGPT in that way. Also, because this is an enterprise account, none of the data is used to train ChatGPT's model. It's kept secure, confidential, and even on the free version, you can go to settings, data controls, and you can turn off this improving the model for everyone. So that will mean that anything you put into ChatGPT, it won't be used by the company to train its model. So be aware of those two important customizations. Okay, so there's my prompt. I'll put in the prompt and let it digest that. There you go, it's digested it. So what it wants me to do, well, let's just quickly look at the prompt. I've told it its role. Okay, like I say, I've copied and pasted this from one of the research articles and modified it slightly. So you tell the bot its role, it's doing qualitative thematic analysis. You then give it different steps that you want it to take. You want it to read the text, which in this case would be an interview transcript, identify key ideas, arguments, themes, content, analyze the text, generate codes, and you tell it what the codes, what codes are. If you didn't tell it what a code is, then of course ChatGPT, the model itself, does have I won't say understanding. It has been trained on literature so that it will know what to do when you ask it to code. But it's worth telling it explicitly what kind of codes do you expect. And of course, this could be whatever. You could be using the Saldana book on coding data and give it a specific coding technique here that you want it to perform. And then you're telling about its output. And then there's a second step. And then there's finally a third step. Again, you'll see this in the literature that I've borrowed from. Okay, so I'm going to upload a transcript, and I have practiced doing this 2 or 3 times, and I'm hopeful it will work. So the research data that I have is a case study of Newark College that has a musical instrument making degree. I do educational research. They have a musical instrument making degree, and I am doing a case study of that degree program. It's an unusual program because students are making and repairing violins, guitars, various instruments. So I've interviewed all the students and staff, or I did. This was a couple of years ago. I've visited multiple times and collected field notes and so on. But here I'm just uploading one transcript. Right, so I will ask it to run step 1. Okay. So yeah, we have the participant, we have the code, and then we have a quotation against each code. And yeah, we have files here. Well, we know what data it's from because we're doing this one transcript at a time. I did upload 10 transcripts at once and went through the same exercise when I was practicing this. It did the work, but much more superficially. So I'm getting more out of the analytical process by doing it one transcript at a time, as you would if you were doing it manually. But here you can see effectively it's got quotes against codes against participants. Okay, so that's working as instructed. You then give it step 2. Now, step 2 is where it clusters the codes. Okay, so we have the quotation, we have the code, we have a description, we have the cluster, and we have a description of the cluster. Okay, so this kind of looks and feels like a form of thematic analysis. And then finally, step 3 is developing I suppose, the ultimate themes. So you tell it to work on the text running the third step, which you've instructed it. Yeah, and it has, well, here what I've done is I've asked it to look specifically for craft education, specific code, and not just education. And it has kind of condensed that transcript here into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 codes with explanations. Okay, so, you know, of course, we can question the quality of this, as I tried to make clear throughout this presentation. But in terms of, you know, it functionally doing what we do when we do thematic analysis, it can imitate that. And the article I borrowed this technique from was generally very positive with the research that they developed this out of. So, you know, you'll see that there is a general optimism, really, I think, in the literature for AI to be used in this way, with various caveats, of course. So, yeah, personalize AI, as I've said, create a workspace, as I've just shown you. I did try using or creating a specific GPT using ChatGPT, where you create your own specific model for a particular use, using that same technique I've just demonstrated. It didn't do it as well, to be honest. I didn't really have time to find out why, but the initial experiments creating a GPT and giving it a kind of a methodology for analysis, I didn't find as accurate as just using a normal ChatGPT window. When you are working with AI, keep track of your prompts. Yes, it will keep a history if you allow it, but you know, it doesn't, as far as I can see. For example, ChatGPT, it won't keep a history of when you prompted it. The model might change. Remember that you have to be able to demonstrate transparency in your research, and you need to be able to, although you don't know what it's doing, you need to be able to say what you did, how you used it. Something I would recommend, well, for everybody, students definitely, because you're going to be interrogated by examiners, is as an exercise really in learning all about this and using it, is to write up an account of how generative AI works. Partly so you don't forget what you're dealing with, and so you can discuss it in your thesis if you are going to use it in your research, which I'm not wholly endorsing, but if you do, and who knows, some of you might not be analysing data for another year or two, and by that time, you know, it may be much more kind of normal to do so. Write up an account of what generative AI is and how it works. Make sure that you understand the basic principles of it. You know, what a foundation model is, what probabilistic modeling is, self-attention mechanisms, big data, deep learning, neural networks, and do so in a way that satisfies yourself and potentially your examiners. Okay. This is not like using SPSS to do statistical analysis for you. SPSS is a tool that has well-known kind of maths behind it. It's transparent in that you know the statistical test. You can look it up in a textbook that the tool is using. Whereas with AI, you don't know how it works. The best you can do is to learn what these terms mean and generally how the technology operates. Write up an account of your analysis while you're doing it, of course. Use it to think with your data. That's, I suppose, what I would recommend at the moment. It may be useful for you as a kind of way, as I said, to have this kind of workspace where you can just kind of query your data, documentation, literature, just have it as a space to question and think with, rather than using it formally for analysis. And again, a reminder that ChatGPT and NotebookLM are not designed for what we do. But fortunately, NVivo and Atlas are just beginning to integrate the technology into their software in a way that is familiar and works as you would expect if you've used NVivo or Atlas. A much more robust tools. Right, I'm not going to go through the next few slides, but when these slides are shared or on YouTube, what I did was I took, yes, actually, this particular exercise, I was asking ChatGPT about the use of AI for qualitative analysis. And this is some of the considerations it came back with, which I think I've kind of covered enough. But what I wanted to do was just end on these two that I've highlighted, which are the so-called future directions that ChatGPT came up with. And that is integrate AI features into these qualitative analysis platforms, which, as I've said, NVivo and Atlas are doing. And they assure you that it's secure and private. So this is a good future direction. It will get us away from using ChatGPT for thematic analysis, which a lot of the research you'll find at the moment is based on, but I don't think is the way forward. But more importantly, what we're doing today, train researchers in AI literacy to leverage the tools critically and creatively. And I think that these two things, you know, the SENSS network can train researchers in AI literacy. That's what we're doing. And the software manufacturers can integrate this technology into the tools that we use. I think I'll end there. There are references that you can look up, but as I say, the notebook LM that I shared has more, and including many of these. Okay, I'll just stop sharing my screen. Thank you. I think, well, I'm finished. Anna's finished. I think now it's time for questions.
Yeah, Franciscus.
Can I ask one? So one of the important aspects of qualitative is because researchers can approach it, you know, with different ways. So if you give two researchers, you know, the same interview, they could come with relatively different coding, relatively different approach. And given that the version of ChatGPT, Joss, you're using is not storing the data, which means, you know, you could, have you actually tried repeating the exercise a few times with ChatGPT, or equally, have you tried doing it with other AI, Gen AI engines like Gemini or anything like that to actually compare the consistency of the approach, and you know, whether we have the same impact here, where you have researchers approaching the interviews in very different ways? Thank you.
Yep. Well, yes, you won't get identical outputs from two different models, and also the functionality. So I have used Gemini, again, the paid for version, and ChatGPT, the paid for version, given it the same data. Well, I forget which one, but some of them complain about the number of files we're uploading. Some of them seem to kind of lose or forget certain files over time. So yeah, the memory in those two tools is poor. Notebook LM is quite different in that it again is a secure, private space. It doesn't share it with Google, anything that you add to Google, but it retains everything. And as you could see down the left-hand side, it effectively just has the sources there available for use at any time. So yes, I think I haven't tried over, say, several days or weeks stopping and starting data analysis. It's always been in kind of short spurts of experiments. But I would definitely want to do one transcript at a time. And once it's performed the analysis, I would then want to get it off of the tool as quickly as possible into something like Excel or some other more permanent way of storing the data, because I would not trust it to keep the data available to me. Alex, I think.
Yes, that was a really, really good presentation. Thank you. So would you suggest, if we use AI, say we were to use AI in like our coding, would you suggest always being completely transparent about everything we do on it? Because I feel like we're still at the point where any use of AI seems to be frowned upon, and then we'll end up some people being transparent about it and having used it not as much as some people, and then some people using it loads and loads and loads and then not declaring it. So, and then I think that some people are going to get a bad rep unfairly. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I agree. I don't think you can necessarily or would necessarily have to have an appendix full of every kind of interaction with AI that you made. I think if you're using it for literature reviews, personally, I think just a statement, a kind of methodology in your methodology for your review, perhaps about how you used it, as you would expect in a literature review. When it comes to data analysis, as I said, I don't think I will use ChatGPT to do thematic analysis, but I think I will use NVivo or Atlas at least one time, just to publish something where I've used a kind of a different way of analyzing the text. And if you're using those tools, then you have the transparency you would expect from those tools. The demonstrations I've seen of those tools, you know what data it's looking at, you have the data there in front of you, the whole data set, it highlights the full quotation, whereas you could see the ChatGPT one didn't. The demonstration I gave, it gave me an excerpt. You can select codes, you can deselect codes. So ultimately, whatever the AI produces using something like Atlas, you have control over what you end up adopting. So in that case, again, you wouldn't need to keep track of every interaction with the AI, because you would be using a tool that is well documented, and you could just describe your use of the tool.
Thank you. That makes sense.
I could just say, Alex, I understand your challenge, and I faced the same, and my students face the same. I do feel that for the time being, we really don't understand this. I would use it, but I would use it as complementary to human analysis. I wouldn't just use ChatGPT. So, for instance, I would sometimes do it if I'm not if I'm in a project where several people collected the data. I might use it as a first screen, like as a memo, to get a feel for the data before I do the analysis. Or if I'm the only coder, I do the analysis and then I use these in the end to see if there is something new. And so that's how I would use it for the time being, to complement manual analysis. And I put a note. I shared the link on the chat where they use both, and I find that actually they find different themes. Humans find themes that don't exist in data, and vice versa, just like the ones I mentioned with synthetic data. So I think there are benefits. You do find things, new things, but it may not. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the first point I made, I'll just go back to it, and also it refers to the question earlier. If you have two researchers doing thematic analysis, you will get slightly different outcomes from that qualitative interpretive research. That's accepted, and in fact, that's kind of built into the methodology. That's seen as a strength. You know, that's the same with AI as well. And I think, as Anna said, it's a useful way of checking yourself, seeing if you can kind of get anything else out of the data. The main issue for me goes back to the philosophical issue about whether you are committed to a research methodology that philosophically values human interpretation of, you know, the social world, in my case, education. And if you're committed to that philosophical kind of worldview, then I don't see how AI can honestly be used, particularly as a primary tool. Maybe, again, maybe as a way of kind of checking on yourself, maybe as a form of reflexivity, but not a form of analysis.
Thank you. Yeah, that really makes sense. Yeah, no, I mean, and now I have to think about this because my way, my methodology is quite interpretivist, so I'll have to have a think, but I'm not at that point yet, but thank you.
I wonder if anyone here in the audience has used it and has any kind of tips to share. I think the other thing that I saw at some time ago is that there was this person who had, this AI trolley dilemma, right? When you present dilemmas about if there is one person, would you deviate the trolley or not? And depending on how they phrased it, the context, the answer, the ChatGPT's answer would vary widely. So this means that they're very sensitive to the wording, to how things are worded, more than as humans, we might understand the meaning behind those words, whereas ChatGPT probably doesn't. That could be a problem here. Yeah, sorry, I was distracted. I thought somebody wanted to come in. So that could be a problem, that it may be more sensitive to how things are worded than we are as humans. Any more questions? So if there are no more questions, do we want to share the link for the next one? It was in my slide, but so the video will be shared in our. I'm just trying to open my slide to get the link for the next session. If you want to join us, if anyone wants to join us next week, where we look at use of AI for other types of data other than purely text data. But thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.